Imagine being shipped across the sea to marry one of the most infamous kings in history, only for him to take one look at you and decide, absolutely not. That was Anne of Cleves' introduction to England, and to Henry VIII, a man who had already gone through wives like bad Tinder dates. Most people today call her the lucky wife, the one who got away with her head still attached. But luck isn't always sweet. Sometimes surviving just means you're stuck living in someone else's shadow. Anne was born in 1515 in Dusseldorf, in the Duchy of Cleves. Not London, not Paris, not Madrid, Dusseldorf. A perfectly respectable city, but it wasn't exactly the glamorous hub of Renaissance court culture. If Henry's England was like the Tudor version of Hollywood, Anne's hometown was more like a quiet provincial town, where the biggest news of the year might be a new church bell. And her childhood? It couldn't have been more different from what Henry's court would later demand. While other royal kids were learning how to sparkle in front of foreign courts, Anne's upbringing was all about modesty and religious duty. Her family believed in Lutheran piety, structure, and discipline. Think less prepping a queen for dazzling audiences, and more raising a daughter who could run a household with order and devotion. If Catherine of Aragon's youth was like a Spanish Disney princess training montage, glittering palaces, Latin lessons, elegant dances, and Anne Boleyn's was like a French finishing school rom-com filled with charm, wit, and flirtation. Anne of Cleves' childhood was the total opposite. Her life was basically like being enrolled in a strict boarding school run by nuns. No sparkle, no glamour, no late-night parties with foreign ambassadors. Her court was modest, conservative, and deeply religious. The values drilled into her were humility, obedience, and virtue. To be clear, these weren't bad qualities. They made her respectable, dependable, the kind of woman who'd make a perfectly good duchess in Germany. But the English court? That was like a talent show where survival often depended on whether you could sing, dance, or keep up with the king's banter at dinner. Anne hadn't been trained for any of that. She didn't play instruments, didn't speak Latin, and wasn't taught witty conversation. Nobody ever sat her down and said, "Here's how you make eye contact with a king just long enough to keep him interested, but not so long you get accused of witchcraft." That wasn't her world. Instead, she learned embroidery, household management, and prayer. She could oversee servants, keep an estate running, and recite her devotions perfectly. Totally fine for a duchess back home in Cleves, but disastrously mismatched for a court where your ability to flirt could literally keep you alive. In England, charm wasn't just decoration, it was survival. Fast forward to the late 1530s, Henry was in desperate need of a wife, again. His first marriage had ended in a messy international divorce. His second ended with a public beheading, and his third ended with Jane Seymour dying in childbirth right after giving him a son. He was lonely, paranoid about alliances, and still fixated on securing more heirs. If this were a modern dating profile, Henry's would have read, "Single dad, 6 foot, loves hunting, moody, powerful, into heirs, looking for someone who won't get beheaded." Not exactly a swipe right scenario. Enter Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister. The guy who, for years, was basically Henry's fixer, part lawyer, part bureaucrat, part magician, who somehow made Henry's crazy ideas actually happen. This is the man who engineered the break from the Pope, restructured the entire English church, and managed Henry's political messes with frightening efficiency. But by the late 1530s, Cromwell had a new job: royal matchmaker. Now, Cromwell wasn't playing Cupid out of the goodness of his heart. He wasn't sitting in his office doodling hearts around the names of European princesses. He was calculating. England, at this point, was in a very awkward political spot. Henry had broken with the Catholic Church, which meant powerful neighbors like France and Spain weren't exactly sending him Christmas cards. England was Protestant, sort of, and it needed allies to avoid being swallowed whole. So Cromwell looked east toward the Protestant states of Germany, and there was the Duchy of Cleves, ruled by Anne's brother, Duke William. Small but strategically important, Protestant enough to annoy the Catholics, and respectable enough that Henry could say, "Look, I'm marrying into a noble family." From Cromwell's perspective, it was perfect. Anne herself, she was noble, she was unmarried, she was Protestant. Politically, she was a dream. Personality and chemistry, that was less important to Cromwell. To him, this wasn't a love story. This was risk, the board game. And Anne was a move on the map. If this were Tinder, Cromwell wasn't swiping right because Henry was attracted to Anne's profile picture. He was swiping right because her location tag said Germany. It was pure geography. She wasn't Henry's type at all. Remember, Henry loved charmers, musicians, witty conversationalists, women who could dazzle him at court. Anne was none of those things. But politically, she was a solid, stable option. Cromwell looked at Anne of Cleves and thought, this isn't true love, but it's a good alliance. And more importantly, it keeps England safe. Of course, Henry wanted to know what she looked like. No FaceTime, no selfies, just a painter with a good brush. So Cromwell sent Hans Holbein the Younger, one of the most talented portraitists of the time, to capture her image. Holbein painted Anne in her best light, literally. And Henry saw the portrait and thought, jackpot. She looked calm, serene, composed. Henry thought he'd found a solid match. But when Anne arrived in England in late December 1539, reality didn't match the profile picture, and that's putting it mildly. Henry decided to do this weird rom-com stunt where he disguised himself and burst into her chamber for a surprise kiss. You know, the kind of thing that would get you arrested today. Anne, being practical, German, and completely unfamiliar with English courtly games, reacted like a woman whose personal space was just violated by a stranger. She didn't swoon. She didn't giggle. She basically gave him the 16th century equivalent of "Do I know you?" Henry's ego, which was roughly the size of England itself, cracked in half. From that moment, he was out. Still, the marriage went ahead because politics didn't care about vibes. On January 6, 1540, Anne of Cleves officially became Queen of England. And here's where things went from awkward to catastrophic. On the wedding night, Henry later claimed he just couldn't do it. He told his doctors he couldn't bring himself to consummate the marriage, blamed her body, her appearance, even her smell. Some modern historians suspect Henry had performance issues at this stage, but he made sure the entire court believed it was Anne's fault. Basically, Henry ghosted her in public. Imagine being a newlywed and finding out your husband is going around telling his friends you're too unattractive for him to sleep with. That was Anne's honeymoon. By July, just 6 months later, the marriage was annulled. The official reason was a prior betrothal and non-consummation. The unofficial reason? Henry just wasn't feeling it. And here's where Anne showed her survival skills. She didn't fight it. She didn't protest. She didn't demand her crown back. She agreed quietly and with dignity, which, frankly, might have saved her life. She'd heard of Anne Boleyn. She knew Catherine Howard would soon be in danger. She wasn't about to test Henry's patience. In return, Henry gave her what looked like a golden parachute. She got estates, palaces, and an allowance that made her one of the wealthiest women in England. He even gave her the strange but useful title of the king's beloved sister. It was the 16th century equivalent of being friend-zoned, but with benefits. Compared to the other wives, beheaded, banished, dead in childbirth, Anne looked like she'd played the game perfectly. But here's where the so-called luckiest wife story doesn't hold up. Yes, she was alive and rich, but she was also a foreigner in a court that never fully embraced her. She had no kids to secure her place. Her German attendants were dismissed, leaving her isolated. And while Henry was cordial, she was always at arm's length. She wasn't central. She wasn't powerful. She was like a player on the team who gets paid, but never sees the field. And imagine the humiliation of watching Catherine Howard, a teenager young enough to be Anne's niece, step into the role she had briefly held. Catherine was everything Henry thought Anne wasn't: flirty, English, and vivacious. Anne had to smile at court events, congratulate the king, and hand over her crown with grace. It was like being dumped and then invited to the wedding of your ex a month later. Painful, but Anne endured it. She continued to live in England after Henry married Catherine Parr, and when Henry died in 1547, she stayed. Returning to Cleves might have seemed like the obvious move, but Anne likely knew she'd be safer and wealthier in England. Still, her position was strange. She was part of the royal orbit, but never at its center. Under Edward VI, she was politely ignored. Under Mary I, she had a brief hope of closeness, since she had always treated Mary kindly during her youth. But religion got in the way. Mary was fiercely Catholic. Anne was Protestant, and that was enough to put her back on the sidelines. The years dragged on, and Anne began to fade. She never remarried. She never had children. She never held real political influence. She became the quiet background figure of the Tudor drama, wheeled out occasionally for events, but never part of the main plot. By the early 1550s, her health was failing. Chronic coughing, chest pains, weakness. It was likely tuberculosis or cancer. In modern terms, she was only in her late 30s, but her body was already breaking down under years of stress and illness. Her final years were spent at Chelsea Old Manor, living quietly with a small household. She revised her will in June 1557, leaving modest gifts to servants and donations to the poor. These weren't the grand gestures of a reigning queen. They were the careful parting notes of a woman who had lived without power, but still valued loyalty and kindness. A month later, on July 16, 1557, Anne of Cleves died at the age of 41. Her death was muted. There was no national mourning, no grand funeral. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, which sounds prestigious, but her tomb is tucked away in a side aisle where most visitors pass without noticing. Even in death, she was overlooked. So, was Anne of Cleves lucky? She avoided the axe, yes. She avoided dying in childbirth. She avoided years of being bullied by Henry's ego. But her survival came at the cost of loneliness, invisibility, and being remembered as little more than a punchline in Henry's marriage history. Survival isn't always sweet. It can be slow, isolating, and quietly tragic. What makes her story matter isn't that she escaped Henry's wrath. It's that she outlasted everyone else. She outlived all of Henry's wives. She endured humiliation without bitterness. She lived in exile within England with dignity. And she never let Henry's cruelty define her behavior. She wasn't lucky. She was resilient. She played the game in a way no one else could. And though history often forgets her, maybe she deserves more recognition than the women whose tragedies stole the spotlight. So next time you hear someone call Anne of Cleves the lucky one, ask yourself, what's luck? Is it keeping your head but losing your crown? Is it surviving while slowly disappearing from memory? Or is it simply making the smartest choice in the worst circumstances and living long enough to be buried quietly in Westminster Abbey? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Was Anne truly lucky or just quietly tragic? And if you enjoyed this dive into the life of one of history's most overlooked survivors, hit like, hit subscribe, and I'll bring you more stories from the shadows of history that deserve to be heard.